Hey guys, it's Eamon. So I'm going to be taking a look at a really important game in the career of Bobby Fischer. This is his 1971 candidate semifinal match versus Ben Larsen. And this match is of special interest to me because it was played in Denver, and I live in Denver. Now, Denver isn't a very famous chess city, but we do have this one shining example of chess history to look back on. In 1971, Fischer was 28, and he was on an incredible run of form. He had just defeated Soviet Grandmaster Mark Taimanov with a score of 6 wins, 0 draws, and 0 losses in the previous candidates match. However, this time his opponent was the much stronger 36-year-old Ben Larsen. And Larsen had a pretty good score against Fischer. In the 1970 Soviet Union versus the rest of the world match, Larsen had been selected to play board 1 ahead of Fischer, and Fischer agreed to play on board 2 because in the 1970 Interzonal tournament, which was the qualifier for these candidates' matches, Fischer won the tournament convincingly, but in their head-to-head matchup, Larsen had actually defeated Fischer. So this first game of the match would be of enormous psychological importance because Fischer, on this 6-0 run, had a ton of momentum. If he could manage to win another game, he would keep that momentum going. Whereas if Larsen could even manage to draw the game, that would really slow Fischer down. Fischer opens with e4, and Larsen plays the French defense, which must have come as a shock to Fischer because Larsen had hardly ever played this before. d4, d5, and we get the win-a-war variation with bishop b4. Larsen was a great psychological player. He really believed in playing the man. And Fischer had struggled against the win-a-war previously. He had some mixed results against it. In his book, My 60 Memorable Games, Fischer had called the win-a-war anti-positional and weakens the king side. So let's see if he could prove that in this game. e5, knight e7, and a3 forces the dark square bishop to exchange itself for that knight. And we see the classic imbalance in the win-a-war variation. Black gives up the bishop pair in exchange for these weakened c-pawns. Now c5, and Fischer plays a4. So this was a trendy move at the time. The a-pawn advances to give this bishop access to this diagonal, as well as potentially taking away the a4 square from the black pieces later on in the game. However, these days, either knight f3, or queen g4 is preferred. a4, knight c6, knight f3. Both players develop their bishops. And queen c7. It was important for Larsen not to castle in this position, because here the great gift sacrifice with bishop takes h7 was already working. And white would have a winning attack here after knight g5 and h4. So that's why instead Larsen plays queen c7. Now Fischer castles, and Larsen closes the center with c4, kicking the bishop to a worse square. But he relieves all the pressure off of this d4 pawn. And so now white has this nice pawn structure in the center. And Larsen needs to immediately disrupt that. So he plays f6, striking back at this strong e5 pawn. Here Fischer plays rook e1. In a previous game, he had played bishop a3, and he actually lost a game in this variation in the 1962 US Championship. So this is no doubt what Larsen would have been prepared for. Instead, Fischer plays the more flexible rook e1, which is a great waiting move. He's basically waiting to see whether the king is going to go to the king side or the queen side. Larsen now plays knight g6, putting more pressure on this e5 pawn. He wouldn't want to immediately castle here because now Fischer could exchange on f6, and then since the bishop hasn't committed to this a3 square, he could play bishop h6. So that's why rook e1 is more flexible, and Larsen plays knight g6, pressuring this pawn. Now Fischer plays bishop a3, preventing kingside castling, but that does sacrifice this e5 pawn. And Larsen is up for the challenge. He takes the pawn. we get an exchange of pawns and then an exchange of knights. Now, queen takes e5 would not be a very good move in this position because it walks into the line of the rook. And Fischer could exploit that with bishop g4. And if queen takes c3, then queen takes d5 is a strong move. And after castles, bishop takes e6. Black's king is very exposed here, and Fischer would basically have a free attack. So that's why the knight needs to recapture on e5. And now Fischer plays queen d4, which is powerful centralization. The queen looks at both wings of the board, as well as keeping an eye on this central pawn here. The knight drops back to g6, and now Fischer plays bishop h5, which not only pins the knight, it also opens up the rook along the e-file. So that means that there's an immediate threat to play queen takes d5 in this position. So Larsen needs to deal with that somehow. One pragmatic way to play would have been to play castles queenside, which gives back the pawn. And after b6, Fischer could forcibly go into this endgame where it's equal material, but Fischer could give a check and then trade off this knight. And here, after rook takes a5, material is equal, but Fischer is certainly better here because this bishop is much stronger than its counterpart on d7. This bishop is going to rule the dark squares, not to mention Black's king could be in danger in some variations. So Larsen, ever the optimist, decides to try to hang on to his pawn. And he plays king f7, which is a very ambitious move, but it does permanently leave the king in the center here. However, he has a concrete idea with king f7. If Fischer does nothing, he wants to play rook e8 and king d8. And that would secure his king. If he can accomplish those two moves, he'll be up a clear pawn without too much compensation. So Fischer needs to try to act quickly. And the best way to get at that king is to try to open the position with a pawn break. And so he plays pawn f4, which is a great move. And his intention is simply to play f5. However, f4 is also a double-edged move. Whenever you advance your f-pawn, you weaken your king along this diagonal, which doesn't look like it's going to be very relevant at the moment. The queen is sitting nicely on d4, but we're going to see later in the game this does become very relevant. Larsen continues with his plan, rook e8, and Fischer plays f5. Now, this pawn has to be taken because the knight is in a pin. So pawn takes, and now queen takes d5. So Larsen's center has been destroyed, and the king has to step up to f6 here. If he tries bishop e6, this simply doesn't work. Fischer would have a nice tactic with rook takes e6, and queen takes f5, removes the pawn on the f-file so that the rook can now swing over, and here the king is going to have to step away, and white is going to pick up this rook with a winning position. So that's why after queen takes pawn, the king had to come up to f6. And the king looks very exotic on f6. Normally, you don't want your king to be your most advanced piece. However, there's no immediate kill here. There's still lots of complex variations that Fischer had to comb through to try to find the best move. And it's not really possible to find the best move through calculation alone here. He played bishop f3. However, the best move was bishop d6, activating that dark square bishop with a gain of time against the queen. And one possible variation could have been queen c6, trying to trade queens. However, then the queen would dip back to d4, king would come out to g5, and then the bishop would come back to f3 with another gain of time against the queen. Black will still try to trade queens. White, of course, is having none of that. Queen back to c7. And now the move that's so easy to miss, bishop e7 is actually a winning move. And the point is that if Black takes this bishop, now his king is more exposed. Queen takes g7 comes with a check. The knight could come back to g6, but now h4 disrupts the position of that Black king. and the black king is going to get hunted down here. After king f4, the queen could zigzag back to f2. And now after king f4, even though black is up a knight here, after rook e1, it's going to be mate on the very next move. No matter what Larsen plays, it would be mate. So that's why bishop d6 was the way to go there. But Fischer plays bishop f3, which is not the best move and gives Larsen a chance to come back in the game. And I think it's this moment, this decision between bishop d6 and bishop f3 really highlights one of Fischer's weaknesses in chess. He was an excellent calculator. He could calculate incredibly deeply, but he wasn't as intuitive as some other players, say, for example, Mikhail Tal, who navigated chaos better than anyone. So bishop f3 was played. Now the knight comes back to the center, attacking this bishop. Larsen would love to eliminate one of those bishops, so queen d4 pins the knight, and king g6 unpins the knight and renews the threat of bishop d5. And this is a critical moment in the game. If Fischer plays a normal-looking move like bishop d5, then knight g4 would actually give black enough to play here. Because of the weakness of h2, Fischer could still try to fight on with bishop d6, which is a flashy-looking move. Of course, if queen takes d6, then bishop f7 would win the queen. But Larsen would not need to take that bishop. He could play queen b6, trying to trade queens. And a logical repetition could have been bishop c5, bishop queen back to c7. And this could have been a logical way for Fischer to agree to a draw. But Fischer was incredibly ambitious. He really wanted to win this first game. And so he started to calculate incredibly deeply. And he went for rook takes e5. And the calculation involved in this move is ridiculous. He had to see about 10 moves in advance and see some really deep variations. So queen takes e5 was played. Rook takes e5 was, of course, not possible because bishop d6 would fork those pieces. So queen takes e5 needs to be played. And now Fischer can take this bishop. So he's won 2 minor pieces for a rook, but there's going to be counterplay against his king. Larsen activates this rook with a game of time against the queen. So queen takes b7. And now queen e3 was played. Queen c3 was also an interesting move, but Larsen chose the most direct, queen e3 check. This forces the king to f1. If king h1, then there would be this back rank checkmate with queen e1. So that's why the king had to come to f1. And now Larsen plays rook d2. And it looks like this is an inescapable mating net. The threat of queen f2 checkmate is quite powerful. But Fischer has worked out a solution here. He plays queen c6 check. Larsen plays rook e6. And again, it looks like there's 2 threats, the threat of checkmate and the threat to the queen. But Fischer has found the brilliant defense, bishop c5. Whoops. He plays bishop c5, which counterattacks the queen and is a X-ray defense of this f2 square so that Larsen can't play queen f2. Let's see. One move Fischer had to avoid was queen c5, which looks like it does the same thing, but this would actually lose to rook f2 check, forcing the king to g1. And now Larsen could have played rook takes bishop, and after queen takes, he would be up the exchange here. So that's why it was necessary to play bishop c5. And incredibly, there's no win for Larsen here. The best he has is to play rook f2, and the king steps to g1. Again, it looks incredibly risky to put your king in the path of a discovered check, but Larsen doesn't have anything better here than rook takes g2, king takes, queen d2 check, so the queen comes to a safe square, but king h1, rook takes c6, and bishop takes c6. So Fischer would have had to see this entire variation back when he played rook takes e5. And to determine that he's actually okay in this position is incredible because white has 3 pieces for the queen, which is a good material imbalance. However, all of these pieces are hanging. None of them are secured by pawns. And the king could be vulnerable in some variations. And this position is about equal. If Larsen had played a5 here, saving his a7 pawn, the game probably would have ended in a draw. However, Larsen went for queen takes c3, which is a mistake because, first of all, the rook is attacked, but Fischer can save that. Rook g1 check, king f6, and now Fischer can pick up that a7 pawn. And his king is relatively safe here, and with the 2 bishops ushering this a pawn down the board, Larsen is in a lot of trouble. The computer claims that Larsen could still save himself here with the move king e6. However, that is not at all obvious. It's still Fischer would still have an edge here. But Larsen went for g5, which is definitely a mistake because this g-pawn could become vulnerable in some positions. And now Fischer shows great technique to wrap this game up. He plays bishop b6 with the intention of playing a5, anchoring that bishop. Queen takes c2. So Larsen has his own pass pawn, but it's not nearly as quick. Fischer's plan is pretty simple. A5, queen b2. So for the moment, he can't advance a6 because the bishop on b6 would hang. But bishop d8 check puts that bishop on a safe square, and now he can't advance a6. And at this point, Larsen is losing. Queen a3, but bishop b7 anchors that pawn. Queen c5 was tried, but now after rook b1, c3, Larsen is desperately trying to push his own pass pawn, but it's too late. After bishop b6, Larsen resigned the game. If he tries c2, then simply rook e1 check, and Fischer is going to take the queen on the next move. Otherwise, if he moves the queen, there's no stopping a7, a8. Fischer is going to be up a ton of material. All right, so fantastic calculation there. And I find this game really symbolic of Fischer's strengths and weaknesses. In this incredibly, we could say, irrational position, where it's not possible to find the best move by calculation alone, but instinct was necessary, he didn't find the best move, bishop d6. Instead, he found a logical move, but not the best move, bishop f3, which would have allowed Larsen good chances to draw. However, a few moves later, he found the incredible rook takes e5, which would require a ton of calculation, and most players would have reached this position in their calculations and simply thrown out the variation because it looks like mate is unstoppable. But Fischer was willing to put in the work to look deeper, and he found this incredible defense with bishop c5, saving the game and then going on to win the game with his 2 bishops versus rook. And so it was an incredible game. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please like the video if you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in my next game analysis. Bye.